Prior to 1914, nationalism and militarism were growing trends in Europe. Tensions mounted as nations competed for colonies in Africa and Asia. Fueled by nationalism, the competition threatened to end decades of relative peace. Many countries had formed alliances with one another in case war should arise. On June 28, 1914, the storm broke. Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife were assassinated while visiting nearby Serbia. After the Archduke's assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Other nations quickly came to the aid of their allies. As a result, Europe's main powers were aligned into two camps. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire made up the Central Powers. Britain, France, and Russia made up the Allied powers. People referred to the war as the Great War because so many countries were involved.
The Great War was total war. It wasn't human. It was something bigger than humanity and escaped from human control. Another way to put it is that the machinery of war expanded much more rapidly than did the capacity of human beings to control it. It got out of control.
The technology of war had evolved in a deadly way. New weapons like howitzers, machine guns, and mortars were accurate and could kill and injure scores of men at a time from great distances. These new weapons forced soldiers and generals to adopt a new strategy: trench warfare. Long trenches were dug into the ground and were used as camps and posts. The trenches stretched almost 450 miles from the northeastern border of France down to the southeastern border. Soldiers of the Allies and the Central Powers faced each other in these long opposing defensive lines. The space between the two sets of trenches was called no man's land. This desolate landscape was covered with holes from bombs and shells. When generals ordered an attack, soldiers dashed from their trenches across no man's land. But enemy machine guns and artillery ripped through the attackers' lines. Attacks rarely succeeded, and they generally produced tens of thousands of casualties. Poison gas was also a new weapon on the battlefield, one that soldiers dreaded. When armies released mustard and chlorine gas, the chemicals burned and choked soldiers, leaving many dead and others blinded or with scarred lungs. If the wind shifted, these terrible weapons could even hurt soldiers of the army that had used them. Eventually, soldiers on the front lines wore gas masks for protection. Trench warfare became a stalemate. Neither side could dislodge the enemy from its trenches. Then the Allies developed a new weapon: tanks. Tanks were armored vehicles with tracks that allowed them to move over broken ground and even barbed wire. They could be used to cross no man's land, forcing men out of trenches. Tanks packed a punch, but they did have flaws. They only moved about 4 miles an hour, so there was little surprise. Many got stuck in mud. Others broke down and became unable to move. Eventually, spare tanks were kept close to the front lines and used only to deliver spare parts to other tanks. Other new weapons added to the destructiveness of World War I. This was the first war to use airplanes. Planes were used for bombing, photography, and attacking enemy lines. Sometimes, planes fought each other in spectacular battles called dogfights. While the fighting raged in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson attempted to keep the United States neutral. Wilson tried maintaining commerce with countries on both sides, but British blockades stopped ships headed to the Central Powers. Germany countered the British blockade with yet another new weapon. The Germans employed U-boats, or submarines, that could cruise beneath the surface of the water and launch surprise attacks on ships. This was the first time that submarines were used in great numbers and with such great ferocity. By the end of the war, U-boats had been responsible for sinking 5,000 ships. U-boats attacked any ship thought to be aiding the war effort. On May 7, 1915, a U-boat sunk the British passenger liner Lusitania off the Irish coast. Military supplies were on board, but so were 124 Americans, all of whom lost their lives. Americans were outraged by the attack. Fearing American entry into the war, Germany halted the U-boat attacks. Then in 1917, 2 German actions changed the mind of President Wilson and most Americans. The first was a telegram sent by Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign minister, to the Mexican government. In it, the Germans asked Mexico to attack the United States. In return, Germany promised that Mexico would get back land it had lost in the Mexican-American War. After the British intercepted the telegram, the note was made public, angering many Americans. The second action came when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Once again, American merchant ships were at risk for being sunk at sea. Wilson had seen enough. On April 2, 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. Congress quickly agreed. The country jumped into war mode. World War I was a new kind of war, total war. The military was built up, and factories were switched from making consumer goods to producing weapons and other goods needed for the war effort. The Allies were relieved when the first American forces arrived in France in the spring of 1917. The war had been raging for 3 years. Allied soldiers were tired, and their morale was slipping. Fearing the impact of fresh American troops, the Germans mounted a strong new offensive and pushed deep into France. But the German soldiers were tired as well. American soldiers gave the Allies the support they needed to push the Central Powers back to their original position. Allied efforts took their toll on the Central Powers. On November 11, 1918, German officials surrendered to the Allies. The war was over and the Allies were victorious, but the price was astronomical. Over 50,000 Americans lost their lives and nearly 230,000 were wounded. About 5 million Allied soldiers and 8 million from the Central Powers died. But the war did not just affect the soldiers and armies fighting. Total war affects everyone. Food and medical resources were cut. Cities were hit by powerful artillery. There was no safe haven. An estimated 6.5 million civilians were victims of this brutal war. This terrible destruction left scars on the people of Europe and the United States. Pre-war optimism was gone. Many people felt nothing but loss and bitterness. Bitterness that would mar the peace that followed.